Vice President Jim Bond notified me that he woke up ill this morning and not sure what he has and didn't want to come and spread it publicly. So that's excused. Commissioner Goodman is here. Commissioner Tomaszewski is excused because of a work demand by our bylaws. She's at Munson Hospital in Traverse City at a meeting that she has to attend as the CEO of the Munson Hospital. And we have Commissioner Pelton.
Just arrived.
Yes, to ride. So we do not have a quorum today, but we have folks that have come long distance, some as far as Texas, to make presentations to us, and so we're going to follow through with the presentation in a few moments here. We will honor, of course, the public comments on the agenda related items. That there'll be no action, of course, to any of those, and also just general public comment. So we could do those probably all in one now, and as a follow-up after the presentations, if there's questions after the presentations. We are recording this meeting, but there, of course, will be no official minutes for the meeting because we do not have a quorum. Is there anyone who'd like to make any comments before we begin? Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, there. Hi, Rose.
Want me to sign in? This is for City Council, isn't
Yeah,
it?
City Council, yeah.
My name is Rose Fosdick, and I serve as the coordinator for the Manistee County Human Services Collaborative Body. I also serve as the co-facilitator for the newly formed Housing Action Team. Like so many of the issues facing us these days, housing is a very complex issue. In my opinion, complex issues require intentional collaboration from all stakeholders to seek effective resolutions. I want to thank Clinton for his participation in the Finding Housing Solutions Together Summit that was held this past July. The work of the Housing Commission to provide housing to those living at or below 50% AMI is a crucial piece of the housing spectrum, and it's a crucial voice at the table. I'm also very appreciative of the time Clinton spent helping the Housing Action Team gain a better understanding of the RAD process at our September meeting. Actions I have taken as a private citizen, not with HAT and not with the HSCB, to help renters in Manistee County, and it wasn't just me, I also had collaboration with United Way, the Manistee Friendship Society, and the Commission on Aging, to help renters in Manistee County understand their rights and responsibilities and help them organize, have unfortunately resulted in the City of Manistee Housing Commission withdrawing their participation with the Housing Action Team. October 13th, I received an email from Clinton stating in part, quote, "Community leaders and elected officials only listen to the resident side of the story. When the CMHC tries to respond, we are blamed, and there's no offer to assist us by providing a connection to the resident. Whether or not the Manistee News Advocate has quoted you correctly or not, you have participated in the creation of this situation. The CMHC and I cannot participate in a group unwilling to work with us to seek solutions," end quote. This is very unfortunate, but I feel hearing the residents' voice is crucial, along with understanding the roles of the Housing Commission and the city. When residents tell me they fear repercussions if they voice concerns, I'm not in a position to provide CMHC a connection to that resident. I think the resident meeting held last month was a great step in opening communication, and the HSCB and HAT are more than willing to work with CMHC to seek solutions. In my opinion, a robust low-income housing program requires participation from our human service agencies to provide the supportive services to the population that CMHC serves. I know our agencies are willing to find ways to help CMHC better serve these residents. I appreciate appreciate the opportunity to come today and hear the special presentations regarding the RAD conversion and responsibilities and duties of commissioners post-RAD conversion. Regardless of the restructuring of CMHC through the RAD process, it's my hope that we can all work together to provide safe, affordable housing for our very low-income residents. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose.
Thank you, Rose.
Okay. Our first presentation is going to be from Naomi Byrne, and she's going to present to us the RAD conversion background, achievements, and
Sorry, my chair fell over
Oops.
because of that heavy coat I had to bring from Texas.
there's a handout. There should have been, hopefully everyone has a handout that looks like this that she'll be going through.
So let me know whenever you're ready.
Go ahead.
Hi. So good afternoon. My name is Naomi Byrne, and as Clint said, I'm with EJP Consulting Group. We were actually engaged by CMHC back in 2018 to look at the potential of repositioning CMHC's public housing units under the repositioning programs that were available at the time. Either, as you see when we go through the presentation, HUD programs that are encouraging housing authorities to get out of the public housing arena and move to a different type of subsidy to provide the affordable housing for their residents. So we've been with CMHC since prior to the start of this project. We've worked with CMHC through both phase one, the application for the rental assistance demonstration conversion, work with them on the procurement of a developer partner, and continue to work with them on the operations transition under the RAD model, as well as providing technical assistance and guidance to CMHC as it looks to phase two, the balance of the public housing units as scattered site portfolio. We made a presentation similar to this on the RAD program way back when, in 2019. And I don't know, I think both of you are newer board members, so it's good to meet you both. First thing to just caveat everything that we're talking about is this is not easy stuff. I've been doing housing for approximately 25 years. The RAD program has been around since about 2012. It's still considered a pilot program. And HUD, Housing and Urban Development, continues to make changes to the program every day to assist housing authorities with their specific needs related to conversion transactions. In fact, I just received an email from them 2 days ago specific to a transaction that I was working with another client. And it's approval for changes to the process that they hadn't thought about because of the overlap in a number of different rules and regulations for different programs that get involved in the RAD conversion. So I just caveat that I just say that because RAD is not simple. And one of the things I was talking with Lindsay and Clint about is that within the Department of HUD, you have the Office of Recapitalization, which is the department that manages the RAD conversion process. But because RAD conversions also include other departments of HUD and in some instances like the Century Terrace and Harborview project, IRS, with regards to the low-income housing tax credits, no one at the higher levels thought about how all those programs play together well. So it's relying upon housing authorities like yourself that are implementing actual programs and changes on the ground to identify those issues where there has to be changes and modifications made to programs. So that's my soapbox on why RAD is not easy. So today we're going to be talking about an overview of the RAD program, and I'm under the assumption that what you know about RAD has just been since you've been with the Housing Commission. So I will try to remember to spell out any acronyms, to make references in a simple manner and not take my 25 years of experience and throw it out there. If you have any questions, please feel free to stop me at any time. But we'll talk about RAD. We'll talk about the accomplishments of CMHC and their phase one conversion. And then we'll talk about, lastly, what you have as far as options for phase two. I always like to preface my RAD presentations, FYI, part of my background is actually training HUD and their field offices on their own programs. So I'm a trainer for a couple of different associations and have trained several of the HUD field offices on their programs themselves. So I have a little bit of understanding about how this stuff really works. And what I like to preface my presentation on is the reason things like RAD came about. Nationwide, there is a glut of capital need across the public housing portfolio for all the public housing authorities in the United States. And on average, every housing authority generates about, together, comprised $3.5 billion worth of needs. Some of the public housing out there was built in the 37s and 38s, and it's still there. I, in fact, work for Austin Housing Authority, which is one of the first, and they actually still have some of their units that were built back in the 1930s and 40s on the ground now. Huge glut, $3.5 billion every year of need. Only about $2 to $2.5 billion is actually appropriated by Congress for our housing authorities for current and backlog need. So you can see where across the spectrum, and I said $3.5 billion annually that's generated, it's actually about a $77 billion backlog. $3.5 billion generated annually, $2 billion to get funded by Congress. You're constantly adding to that $77 billion. So several years ago, HUD went through their own strategic plan process, and they actually identified for housing authorities one of their goals, which was to reposition or move approximately 100,000 public housing units out of the portfolio into other programs to be funded. And this is from an agency that historically has only moved 10 to 12,000 annually, and primarily due to deterioration, not through any projected means of program changes like they did with RAD. So RAD, while it's a new program, has been something that has been utilized over the last several years to help housing authorities who have good and decent units and operations move from what is an underfunded federal program to potentially another program where you'll see, as we go through this, there's more stable funding and more ability to leverage what you have to do other things in your communities. One of the points of importance on this big picture slide is that since 2010, Section 8, or Housing Choice Voucher funding, has increased on a per dollar adjusted basis about 35%, while public housing has decreased. And in the public housing world, even if you request $100,000 or $1 million for your public housing site, because congressional appropriations have to be divided across all public housing authorities very rarely get a dollar of federal funding for the dollar that they request. On average, housing authorities get anywhere from 87 to 96%. So you go to HUD and you ask for a dollar, and they already have not given you enough for your capital needs, and then on the operation side, they also cut you back anywhere from 5 to 15%. Now there are aberrations to that. A few years ago, as a result of congressional appropriations, housing authorities saw a nearly 43% increase in their capital funds, but it was for 1 year, and it did nothing to make up for the backlog. CMHC specifically, going to the next slide, when we did our analysis in 2018, we looked at prior physical needs assessments, or PNAs, and there was a 2011 assessment that was done that indicated that there was about 5.75, nearly $6 million worth of need across the public housing portfolio. So around $26,000 to $27,000 per unit. And if you just looked at the amount of capital funds, which is the funding source that HUD allocates to housing authorities to take care of capital repairs, it would have taken 16 and a half years of capital funds for the Housing Commission to address the backlog of their own personal need, not even thinking about what was going to accrue in the future. When we came in 2018, we reevaluated the properties, and it was myself, Scott Jepson, who was a principal in our company at the time and also an architect by trade, as well as another financial consultant. And between the three of us, we've done a number of RAD conversions and assessments. And we thought that the 2011 physical needs assessment was very conservative and very low. And we estimated that there was about 20.7, nearly $21 million across the portfolio of need, so around $96,000 to $97,000 per unit. Now, we were on the very conservative side going the other direction. We thought that there was significantly more need than was actually identified. And if you look again at the amount of capital fund dollars that the Housing Commission receives, based on that analysis, it would have taken 64 years for the Housing Commission to have accrued enough dollars to be able to take care of that $21 million of need. This is not unusual. We often see housing commissions or housing authorities that have, on average, $50,000 to $75,000 worth of need in their public housing units. And these are units that have been taken care of well over the last several decades. But you have a portfolio that's aging, and it comes with things that need to be repaired or replaced when you look at major systems, and that's a cost. Significantly, to Century Terrace, we identified structural issues, including flooding from the property and street runoff, long corridors within the building that didn't have good lighting or good sight lines, and an out of date or obsolete heating system. Harbor View was in better condition, but we still identified the need to update the units and the common areas. The problem with public housing funding is that in addition to not getting enough to finance your capital need, there is no way to borrow or get enough capital to be able to undertake a massive renovation project. There are a couple of different funding tools that housing authorities can tap into, but they don't provide housing authorities with significant cash or significant equity that they're able to use to do rehabilitation in their projects. And in addition, when you're looking at the HUD funding tools, typically they're types of loans. And so the housing authority still has to make debt service payment on the entire amount that is borrowed for capital repairs. Utilizing the low-income housing tax credit program, however, allows a housing authority with a developer partner to be able to access tax credits, which are of no use to the housing authority because you have no tax liability, selling those tax credits for cash, and then that cash is actually what offsets your cost to do rehabilitation or new construction. The result is a much smaller construction loan that converts into a permanent loan. And that means that the Housing Commission and or the developer partner have a much smaller debt that they have to pay on every month. It's like if your grandmother were to give you 50% of the cost to build a new house, now you're only borrowing 50% of the total house cost versus 100%. And that results in a much lower mortgage payment. I mentioned HUD's repositioning goals in 2018. They made it a goal to reposition 105,000 units, and this was over the course of less than 12 months. Repositioning was a term that they coined to describe their intent to remove units from the Public Housing Administration, and they themselves pointed to the $70 billion worth of backlog of capital need to justify the need for providing updated programs and new programs to housing authorities to be able to take advantage of moving out of the public housing funding stream and into another funding stream. And it uses not only programs such as RAD, which was created in 2012, but it also, repositioning encompasses a bunch of different tools and programs from HUD, some of them that have been around for decades. But we have seen over the last several years that HUD has made a point of streamlining and simplifying, as much as the federal government can simplify anything, their programs so that housing authorities, regardless of size, can access the programs and the tools. So generally, what is repositioning? At the bottom line, repositioning is facilitating the preservation, rehabilitation, or demolition and new construction of public housing units by increasing access to financing. It preserves the availability of affordable housing assistance, either through a physical unit or through a housing choice voucher. And because of the way repositioning is structured and the fact that at the end of a repositioning, the housing authority truly has ownership of the asset, it no longer has to ask HUD for permission. Is that me beeping? It no longer has to have permission from HUD to make capital repairs or to move people in and out, because everything the Housing Commission does under public housing essentially has to be approved by the federal government. Repositioning allows a housing authority to take full ownership and to make local decisions about what direction the Housing Commission needs to go with its assets. So for example, under public housing, the federal government gives CMHC capital fund dollars. Housing Commission is responsible for utilizing those dollars for any capital repairs, but you have to get approval from HUD through budget submissions and then amendments. The Housing Commission can't just go out and make repairs or replacements without prior approval from HUD. Under the repositioning, where now the model is the Housing Commission is the true owner of the property, the Housing Commission, through its executive director and staff, can make those local decisions. We need to put new roofs on, let's go put new roofs on. We need to fix the sewer lines, let's go fix the sewer lines. And there's no need to get prior permission from HUD. So repositioning gives autonomy back to the Housing Commission and the local community. It also allows you to use revenue for other things, whereas public housing funds are restricted strictly to public housing. Funds that you potentially receive through a repositioning can be used for other affordable housing purposes as set forth in your bylaws and your charter. So the fees that you're earning through repositioning Century Terrace and Harborview could be used to help develop other affordable housing moving forward. Public housing dollars cannot be used for that purpose. So why are housing authorities and specifically CMHC repositioning? The conversion to Section 8 project-based contracts allows for that revenue increase and a more stable revenue stream. Public housing funds, because they're reliant on congressional appropriations, can go up and down and swing wildly, as we saw a few years ago when Congress decided to boost the capital fund program by nearly 43%. The same thing could happen, but in the reverse direction next year. If Congress decides to appropriate less dollars to the public housing program, then all housing authorities across the nation will see fewer dollars. And there's no consistency in how much Congress decides to appropriate for public housing. Section 8, however, tends to be a much more stable funding stream. Section 8 typically is based on contracts with private owners or landlords related to how much rent you're going to get on a per unit basis. And that rent is contractual. And typically you do not see instances where that rent decreases by significant amounts unless there is a change in the local market and the housing authority cannot justify receiving rents at that level. So if there's a decrease in the local market and the rents, fair market rents are what they're called, go down, then the housing authority or whoever is administering the voucher contract can provide less rent to the owner. But that's a local decision. That's not a federally appropriated decision. It also, as I mentioned, allows you to get access to debt and equity. The other thing with public housing units is you can't borrow against them. The federal government won't let you go to the bank and borrow money against your public housing properties because they say that they own them, even though you have to care for them as a housing authority. Upon conversion, that ownership changes, and you've seen some ownership structure information. I think Jeff Klug will talk to you about some ownership structure, and we'll go over a very brief structure. But under repositioning, you are required to convey the public housing property out of the public housing authority to a new entity. And that new entity now completely owns that property, and you can go to the bank and borrow against it, which is what you do when you go through something like a loan from housing tax credit conversion, because there is a mortgage that is based on the revenue you're generating off of that property, and you're guaranteeing that mortgage with the property itself. You don't have the ability to do that in public housing. In addition, because tax credits will provide housing authorities with equity that you don't typically have, you can combine the tax credit program with repositioning to be able, one, to generate the cash that you can help offset your construction costs, and then two, go out and get the mortgage for the balance of your construction costs, now your permanent mortgage. And now what you've got is a merging of two different programs to allow the Housing Commission to do substantial rehab, or in some instances, brand new construction at a significantly lower cost to the agency, and with no external dollars having to come in from things like the city or other entities, unless you choose to for other purposes. And then that stable and sustainable revenue stream allows you to operate more efficiently as an agency. One of the jokes in the public housing world is you budget starting January 1, but you don't know how much money you get until July. Because as we've seen with congressional budgets, they very rarely get distributed on time. And so continuing resolutions impact federal funding, which impacts housing authorities. And you can make assumptions on how much you're going to get, but until Congress signs the dotted line and instructs HUD to distribute the funds, housing authorities are really unsure about how much they're going to receive in appropriations to operate and to manage their properties. Again, Section 8 is much more stable, and you can rely on that. So operating public housing now becomes operating a regular business. You know how much money you're going to be getting on a regular basis, so you can budget and act appropriately. What are the benefits to repositioning Century Terrace and Harborview specifically? Well, as you've seen, significantly rehabilitated units. Later in the presentation, you'll see some before and after pictures. But though part of the RAD process, the Rental Assistance Demonstration process, is the Housing Commission has to do what's called a RAD physical conditions assessment. You have to do an assessment of the property, and you have to identify over the course of the next 20 years what are the projected capital repairs that you're going to have. And this is across everything within the unit and exterior on the site. And in order to get approved to convert under the RAD program, you have to be able to evidence to HUD that you can generate either enough upfront repairs and or long-term revenue through a replacement reserve that if anything happens, you're covered. Because they don't want you to convert and then not be able to manage and maintain your properties over the next 20 plus years. And so the intent behind RAD is not only that you remove yourself from public housing, but that you are setting up a model financially that you can cover any of the issues that you might have. So as part of the conversion for Century Terrace and Harborview, not only did you get nice upgraded units, but the Housing Commission through the transaction has to create what's called a replacement reserve. This is basically a savings account for any capital repairs that have to take place, and it's very similar to what they do in the private market. And every year, the Housing Commission has to put in a agreed upon dollar amount on a per unit basis into that reserve. So if 2 years from now, roofs need to be replaced, the Housing Commission has significant or sufficient funds in the replacement reserve to be able to do those types of things. Additionally, in Century Terrace and Harborview, there were energy efficiency upgrades that were made, so hopefully the energy costs will go down for residents, along with the new fixtures and finishes and things like that. Rental assistance is guaranteed. One of the provisions of the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program is the very strong tenant protections. And so I was glad to hear from I don't remember, Rose, on advocating for the tenants, because that is one of the unique things about the Rental Assistance Demonstration Program as opposed to the other repositioning tools. It reinforces the tenant protections that tenants currently have in public housing, such as the right to grieve terminations or evictions, the right to form resident councils and be funded at the same level that they were funded in public housing, and to be able to remain in a RAD converted site without the need for re-screening, which means you don't go back through the criminal history, the credit history, check, et cetera, that you went through to get into public housing. What HUD says is that if you're a public housing resident pre-conversion, you're a RAD resident post-conversion. Now, they don't guarantee the same unit because there are some specific requirements around programmatically making sure that you're in the correctly sized unit. And then logistically, as we've seen with Century Terrace, sometimes you're not able to return someone to their original unit. But what it does guarantee is the right to return to a site that is converted under the RAD program. And you're converted with the same affordability. So the tenant rent is calculated the same way in the public housing program that it is in the Housing Choice Voucher program. Tenants pay approximately 30% of their income towards rent. Now, there are some instances in public housing because of some programmatic differences where tenants might have gotten high-income tenants might have gotten an advantage and paid less than 30%, 25, 22, 20%, and they may have seen their rent go up upon RAD conversion, but that's only to get them up to the 30% that everybody else is paying. Because under the RAD program and the Housing Choice Voucher program, there's no allowances for what's called flat rent, as there are in public housing. But no one pays more than approximately 30% of their adjusted income towards rent. So it remains affordable. And the second unique provision about RAD is that it is indefinite. The RAD contract that is signed by all parties says that the affordability is on a 20-year cycle, and that 20-year cycle is renewed indefinitely. There is no requirement for any approvals. It happens. So even if someone doesn't want to do it, you have to continue to offer those units as affordable units through the RAD contract.
So the Section 8 program is a little more restrictive in some requirements that allow people to move into certain residents. So none of that will affect the current residents who will be protected under the RAD conversion.
Correct. And it doesn't matter what income they're at. And that's one of the challenges that when I talked about the programs don't play well together, because the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which is an IRS program, not a HUD program, has very specific income requirements. And if you violate the IRS program, you potentially risk the loss of tax credits, which is, at the end of the day, loss of actual dollars to an investor. What the responsibility of all parties involved is to make sure that all of the programs play well together. And I'll be frank, HUD doesn't think about the tax credit side nearly as much as they should because they're not in the operations of it. But that's one of the things that we talk with CMHC and they talk with other consultants about on probably a daily basis, is how do we make sure that we follow the RAD rules, we follow the project-based rental assistance rule, which actually goes through HUD multifamily, as well as the tax credit rules. Now, new admissions into RAD units, they have a different set of rules because they're coming from the outside on the waiting list. And so there are income restrictions at that point. But any resident that is a public housing resident today will remain housed as long as they want to. And then lastly, one of the good things about transitioning to a voucher program from the public housing program is choice, flexibility in where you can move. Today in public housing, you can't transfer from Manistee Commission's public housing units to Traverse City or anywhere else. You have to get on a new waiting list and go through their process. In the voucher program, there's something that's called choice mobility for project-based rental assistance and project-based vouchers. And it gives tenants an opportunity to receive a tenant-based voucher or tenant-based rental assistance that they can transfer. There are some restrictions, there's always restrictions, but it does allow for more flexibility than you would have had if it remained public housing. Now, specifically getting into RAD, and we mentioned a lot of this stuff, so I won't go through piece by piece, but really the idea of the rental assistance demonstration program is to allow housing authorities to get out of the underfunded and unconventionally funded public housing program, right? It's not sustainable. To get a housing assistance payment contract that you can count on, your RAD rents will never go below your initial contract rents. So you're guaranteed a minimum amount of rent. And so even if the market changes, in the RAD program, the Housing Commission is guaranteed that minimum amount of rent. Otherwise, annually, the rent is adjusted through what's called an operating cost adjustment factor, which is similar to an inflation factor. On average, typically 2 to 3%, although we were greatly appreciative of the increase this year going into 2023, which is nearly 6%. So you're going to see a bump in the rents that you get from HUD through the Housing Assistance Payment Contract.
So we will have our HUD individuals who will be grandfathered in.
Mm-hmm.
And then, are there a certain amount of Are there a certain amount of Section 8 that will be do you do a percentage of what's left? I'm thinking in a business model, you would probably have HUD, then you have certain amount of Section 8, and then you have your full pay clients that would subsidize that whole system. Is that allowed, or are there only certain Section 8? I know there are only so many Section 8 vouchers out there.
Yeah, so if the project is set up from the get-go that you have different types of residents, RAD PBRA, which is a Section 8, so RAD PBRA, non-RAD PBRA, and even market rate, you absolutely can develop a project that has that. That's not what Century Terrace and Harborview have, though. What Century Terrace and Harborview have is all RAD, project-based rental assistance, with a few units that we call market rate units. These are units that are not receiving tax credit subsidy. And that's for residents that might be over income on the tax credit side, but again, still have the right to remain because they're RAD converted residents. So you have essentially 100% subsidized properties between Century Terrace and Harborview, because those market rate units aren't actually for market. They're for individuals that may not meet the IRS tax credit income requirements, but we still have to ensure that they have housing at 30% of their income. And so to make those programs work together, we put them in a market rate unit.
So even those units that are vacant, that we were transitioning and using people in and out, they were vacant at the RAD conversion, those will still stay underneath. Okay?
Yes, they will stay under RAD.
Okay.
Yes. So people that come in off the waiting list are going to be your extremely low income families, your very low income families, and probably a few low income families, but it's all required to be affordable.
Excellent, okay.
You have the access to the private capital through the tax credit program and the private borrowing. You plan for those repairs, and then you have those housing options that physically have been improved, and then potentially choice ability to move with the voucher program. And then just some RAD basics, the stuff that we've just discussed, the renewable contracts, rent setting and the operating cost adjustment factor, the replacement reserves. This is one, the no limitations on use of project cash flow. This is something that the Housing Commission needs to really pay attention to, because you are now generating what's called non-restricted revenue. It's not federally restricted to just being used for public housing. So you can use these dollars to further your mission of safe, decent, sanitary, affordable housing for the community of Manistee, depending on how much you receive and what the board decides to do. You couldn't do that with public housing dollars, but now, since you're essentially working as a private property owner that's receiving housing assistance payments, you're much like the owner-landlord that has one house on the voucher program, except now you have however many units are in Century Terrace and Harborview.
167.
167. So you're receiving that rent, and revenue that you generate after you pay your operating expenses, after you pay your debt service, after you do all that stuff, is now the Housing Commission. You have to decide going forward how you're going to utilize those. Are you going to utilize those for phase 2? Or are you going to utilize those for other affordable housing in and around Manistee? It's a good problem to have, because now you have more ability to do things that you didn't have under the public housing program. But you still retain control. Tax credits are complicated. Okay, and because the IRS sets forth a lot of different rules, you have probably seen these huge org charts where there's several sub-layers of entities, because as a provision of the tax credit program, you have to show different things. And you also have an investor in your tax credits that actually put up the majority of the money, and they have to protect their interest. At the end of the day, though, we put in as strong protections as we can for the Housing Commission, to include things like you still own the land. Right? Doesn't matter what's built on top, you own the land and you're leasing that into the transaction. So you control the transaction from that perspective. You have an interest ownership in the managing entity, and then at the end of the 15-year tax credit compliance period, the first right to buy everyone out goes back to you, so that you now have 100% ownership of the project. So you're not just taking care of it, but now you own it and taking care of it. Okay, and again, that's your attorney. If I say anything wrong, let me know. I feel the attorney going,
Well, yeah, maybe he will, because we've been kind of told that we're completely hands-off on Century Terrace and Harborview as a housing commission.
Okay, you're hands off from the perspective of management, tax credit, compliance, et cetera. okay? And again, tax credits are complicated, but at the end of the day, as much control as we could give to you, which includes owning the land, which includes taking everything over after 15 years, you have. But during that 15-year period, there are a lot of other people at the table. This is a very complicated relationship. And in that respect, yes. I mean, you're not a housing commission that owns it. The housing commission is a very small piece of a larger ownership entity that owns the buildings and is responsible for compliance with not only the HUD programs, but the IRS programs.
Naomi,
Yeah.
after the end of the 15-year compliance period, it goes back to Riverside Housing, the instrumentality,
Yes.
and not the Housing Commission directly.
Okay.
Which, it's connected. To
Yeah,
that.
and so that, I should be clear, that's correct. The 15-year compliance, the first right of refusal is to the subsidiary or the instrumentality that you have created under the Housing Commission. I tend to generalize, which is why attorneys always go after me and correct me, but I generalize and say it rolls back to you guys because you control the Housing Commission and you have control of the instrumentality itself. Okay. But as far as like operations, as far as rules regarding Riverside and how that's structured, that is a separate entity created under state law, and it's separate from a public housing commission in roles, responsibilities, duties, obligations, et cetera. So because that structure is set up, and it has to be set up that way for the IRS side of things, there is a different level of operational control, I should say, as opposed to absolute control. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
It's complicated, but yes.
It's complicated. But one of our roles as EJP and your other consultants, your legal counsel, Melissa, with Reno Kavanaugh, we protect the interests of the Housing Commission to the best of our ability and the best of the program rules. And so that's why I said, in your case, we tried to make it as strong as we could, with the understanding that there are all these caveats that you have to comply with, or all these quirks of the programs. Resident provisions, we talked about a few of these. No involuntary displacement. Now that doesn't mean people don't get relocated, because you have to relocate people to rehab their unit. What it means is that you don't get involuntarily kicked out. We can't just kick you out if there's not a lease violation, right, until you can't come back. So everyone's protected, and you come back to the site, not a specific unit. Now, I know the Housing Authority worked as hard as they could to get people back into original units, and that was a lot easier in Harborview because of the way the rehabilitation went than it was in Century Terrace. And that might have caused a little bit of strife with residents, and sometimes it's hard to explain that the requirement is that you come back to the site. We can try to do more than that and get you back into your original unit, and I know that we've tried to accommodate a number of people's even personal preferences. Definitely have to accommodate medical preferences, but I think we've tried to accommodate, are you a riverside view, are you street side view, et cetera. And so that's been a bit of a challenge because the way the rehabilitation has been done has been in stacks. And so it's hard to move people out and then move them back in when you're going through the rehabilitation work that's being done. So, but we've tried our best. We've been on meetings every week. We have these discussions. Residents don't get rescreened. This has been a little bit of a speed bump in the road as well, because we have to make sure that the residents, even though they're not rescreened from the HUD side, they do have to meet the requirements under the tax credit side. So as we talked about in the case of over-income residents, we can't move an over-income resident into a unit that is set aside for a very low-income resident. So we have to maneuver and negotiate within the tax credit rules to make sure that those residents are protected. And that's a challenge across the nation. Every time you add an additional layer of programs, you add an additional complexity to your project. And here you're doing RAD, which goes through public and Indian housing, project-based rental assistance, which goes through the Department of Multifamily in housing, and then tax credits, which goes through the Department of IRS. They don't talk to each other on a regular basis. We're definitely not going to get them to work together on a conversion. So we have to work through how we can make sure that this goes as smoothly as possible, understanding the unique situations that you have. We've talked about the residents, rent calculated 30% of their income, and the eligibility for tenant-based vouchers depending on availability. Okay, let's get to the fun stuff. This is what I think is the fun stuff. What did you accomplish? Well, you accomplished an $11.4 million in total construction cost for about $68,000 in upgrades per unit at no cost to the housing authority. You didn't have to pay using capital funds. You didn't have to go to the city to borrow money. You didn't have to use community development block grant or home funds. This was all done without any additional cost to the federal taxpayers or to the Housing Commission. That's huge. Because that's a huge investment into your property just through the low-income housing tax credit program that you would not have been able to do otherwise, because the Housing Commission and probably the city doesn't have $11.5 million that they're going to donate into the project for rehab. We were able to get that done through low-income housing tax credits. You also have a replacement reserve that has to be funded to take care of future problems. And while we estimate what that reserve is over the next 20 years, the intention is that reserve continues to fund even beyond the 20 years, so that the Housing Commission will have sufficient funds in place for any future capital need, and you're not reliant on HUD for those capital dollars. Residents were relocated for the most part on site. We were able to do some off-site relocation depending on need or desire. But most of the residents were relocated into a temporary unit on site, and in some instances, in order to minimize the number of moves, they went directly into a new unit. And so we had to balance the desire to minimize number of moves with desires to move back into units that they were originally in if they could, with remaining on site, because we tried not to inconvenience anyone. But if someone had to go off site, whether it was for a medical accommodation or for some other purpose, all costs were covered by the Housing Commission, so relocation expenses were taken care of through the project and ultimately through the Housing Commission. And then lastly, you're preserving units for an extremely low income population, elderly and disabled low income population that you probably need, right? I think, again, speaking to Rose and her earlier comment, there is a need for affordable housing across the nation, and that need is greatly magnified when you look at very and extremely low income individuals and families. And in a lot of cases, your elderly and disabled individuals are on fixed incomes, Social Security. They are just not able to go out and rent on $700, $800, $900 a month. It's just not feasible. So what you have done here through the rental assistance demonstration is you've preserved 167 units of affordable housing for probably one of your most needed demographics in your community, which is great. We love to see that. And that's one of the requirements of RAD. That's one of the reasons we went down the RAD path, is it requires a one-for-one assurance of units, because there are some programs you could have just demolished Century Terrace and Harborview completely and given everyone a voucher, and they could have gone through MISHDA, or they could have gone through Tip of the Mitt or some other voucher entity and left your jurisdiction altogether, and you would have lost those units. And the Housing Commission at the time said, we don't want that. We want to ensure that we protect the residents, and so we're going to go down this pathway and make sure that we keep these residents and keep these units affordable for the residents that need them most. You've got some before and after pictures, and I know pictures are difficult to see sometimes, but the units you had before were not horrible. They were just old, outdated, had some internal issues, you had some system issues in your buildings. That's fixed now. And so not only do you have your internal systems that have been repaired and or replaced, like your elevators, et cetera, your residents get nice brand new units with new cabinets, with new floors, with upgraded bathrooms, upgraded features and fixtures. So I'm guessing that they're enjoying their nicer, newer units now than what they had before. Long-term benefits to CMHC, you retain ownership of the land. We've talked about that. You own the improvements with several partners. You actually manage the occupancy and the lease-up functions as the property manager with compliance oversight, because there has to be compliance to ensure that you meet the obligations of the tax credit program and the project-based rental assistance program. There is a 6-year window where you're basically going to have someone looking over your property management staff, but the intention is at the end of that 6 years that the Housing Commission through Riverside takes over 100% property management without any need for compliance oversight. And then again, as we mentioned at the end of the 15-year period, CMHC, through your affiliate or your subsidiary entity, Riverside, will transition to full ownership of the property, and you continue to maintain that affordability long-term. Couple of org charts. I am not a complicated person. I like to make things simple with pictures, and so tried to evidence in this organizational chart what we've been talking about. Who does what. And you notice, if you look at property manager, it's Riverside Housing Inc., which is a CMHC nonprofit, so it's controlled by CMHC. Okay, that is your into the property, as well as you're part of the members. The Riverside LLC is 40.49% of the managing member, or 49% of the managing member, which is 0.01% of the owner entity. This has to be this way for the tax credit program, because your investor is actually the one that's putting up all the money, so they have to have the majority interest. And because they get benefits from the tax credits and the depreciation, this is how it's structured. But the reality is that Riverside is responsible for managing the property. And at the end of the day, Riverside is responsible for ensuring that the tenants are leased, the units are repaired, and things like that. There is oversight to make sure that the T's are crossed and the I's are dotted. But as we talked today, the housing committee, you're it. You may only have 0.49% at the end of the day, but you're the one that's taking care of everything, just like you are kind of in public housing. We also included on slide 18 just a cost allocation slide to identify just how things are getting paid. When you look at the total number of public housing units, about 77.7%, or the 167, is taken up by Century Terrace and Harborview. And the remaining 48 units, your scattered site units, remain under public housing. So basically what you have done is you've got a parent company that is paying its bills through two different sub-companies. Riverside, which pays its proportion or prorated share of the bills, and then your public housing program, which pays its prorated portion of the bills. If and when you reposition your scattered site units, all of that goes away from public housing, and that 22.3% potentially then is the responsibility of a similarly structured entity specifically related to those scattered site units. Okay? But really right now, from a housing authority, and you have your accountant here too, from an accounting perspective, you're really looking at cost allocation between two different entities for two different sets of properties. We talked some about the resident rights, so I won't go through all of those except to just note that under the RAD program, in public housing, Century Terrace and Harborview, at the end of the day, were set aside for elderly disabled residents. On the project-based rental assistance or project-based voucher side, you cannot designate units. You can only offer what's called a preference. And so the Housing Commission has continued to provide that preference so that Century Terrace and Harborview will continue to house elderly and disabled residents as it has been under the public housing program. There's one slide on benefits to the city, and we like to put this in there because the city is an integral part of any repositioning. They have to be. While the Housing Commission and the city are two separately created units of local government, there is an overlap because the city, for example, is responsible for public streets and repairs to public streets. And even if the Housing Commission has a property like Century Terrace or Harborview that sits along the public street, the city is responsible for ensuring that those public services are provided. So there's always going to be a relationship with the city and the Housing Commission, even though legally they're two separate entities. The city gets to continue to have an affordable housing asset for families or for individuals, elderly and disabled individuals that are extremely low income. And I don't know of any other housing to the same extent that's for that population and for that income. You've got a lot of tax credit projects. In fact, I think you guys just approved, or not you guys, the city, approved a recent proposal for another tax credit, low-income housing tax credit project. That typically targets, though, families that are at 60% of the area median income, or at 50% of the area median income, or even in some instances at 30%. What it doesn't get is folks that are below those income tiers, because those people below those income tiers can't meet the criteria for a pure tax credit program. So Century Terrace and Harborview is serving a demographic that's probably not really well served anywhere else within the community. The city continues through the negotiated municipal service agreement, payment in lieu of taxes. That is the offsetting payment. You don't pay property taxes as the Housing Commission. So instead of paying property taxes, the Housing Commission negotiated an agreement to pay a payment in lieu of that. So you're continuing to pay for those public services that the city should be providing. And again, we mentioned non-restricted funds that the Housing Commission gets can go to further additional affordable housing. So you're taking the onus and the obligation off the city for the provision of affordable housing, because that's what you were created under state law to do, with agreement by the city whenever your original bylaws were signed. You are the entity that is responsible for safety and sanitary affordable housing for low-income families in Manistee. Phase 1, we've talked that one to death. Phase 2 is your next phase, and that's where you've got some significant decisions as an agency to make around phase 2. The original idea with phase 2 was that the Housing Commission would look to rebuilding replacement units either on that site or on another site, because this is 48 units of families, so still very low-income families, but larger unit sizes, not just 1s and 2s, but 2s, 3s, and 4s. And so the original idea was that the Housing Commission, with a developer partner, would go out and utilize the tax credit program again to build brand new units of housing somewhere, transfer the families out of these 48 units, and then tear these 48 units down, because they are in significantly worse condition than Century Terrace and Harborview, especially from a visual perspective. They're not real pretty. I mean, you've done what you can, but they're not really good condition. However, there were some hiccups, and that didn't happen. I think there's been a couple of attempts by the Housing Commission to pursue different projects related to that. But the ability to do that from the tax credit side is dependent on the city's participation. Because one of the requirements in the tax credit program is that you have city concurrence with what you're doing. Not only that, if the Housing Commission goes out and is looking at new land, you have to get approvals if you have to rezone it, you have to get planning approvals. There's all sorts of overlap when you're looking at trying to build new. So right now, you have what we call, you're in the sweet spot for housing authorities. You have a number of different tools that are available to you to reposition. Because the Housing Commission wants to continue the model they have where they're using project-based rental assistance, and they're working through the management and managing it here locally, you really are looking at another RAD conversion, because that's the only HUD tool that results in a project-based rental assistance contract. And another RAD conversion would likely mean that you either have to be able to significantly put a lot of dollars into your current units, which is not worth, or you're going to have to build somewhere else and do what's called a transfer of assistance and transfer the family and subsidies to a new property somewhere else. And so I think those are some of the things that we've been working with the Housing Commission on, and that's on the last slide, working with the Housing Commission on is identifying the potential opportunities you have for that. Because the only other option you have then is to remain as public housing, because those units will likely not pass any kind of housing quality standards inspection without significant capital upgrades. You wouldn't be able to place a voucher in those units, and so you really are, with the condition of those units and the cost, you're really looking at either remaining as public housing, which I don't think any of us want to do with those units, because you're not going to be able to replace or repair or do enough to them to make them where they need to be, or rebuilding somewhere else, and then using the HUD tools to transfer both the subsidy and the families into new units, and then taking those units down. And then after, if you pursue that pathway and you, let's say, build somewhere new, and you transition those 48 families over, and you tear those units down, you can do whatever you want with that remaining property, because it's released from HUD's oversight through a release of declaration of trust. And so now you have more options. You could build more there. You could transfer it to Habitat for Humanity if they wanted to build a new housing complex for moderate income families. You could partner with someone else. You give yourself a lot more options with what you do, but you've got to protect the families that are currently in public housing there, which means you've got to have new units for them to live in, because you can't just kick those 48 families out and then take the property and do whatever you want. You are required to protect them, much like we did with Century Terrace and Harborview residents.
So do you provide the consultation on these conversions?
Yes.
Because neither Jeannie and I have any clue about
Sure.
phase 2.
Hasn't been discussed with us, and we've been
Right.
on since June.
Yeah.
So as we move forward, I know that management has been involved, but I think these are work studies.
Oh, yeah, and we can definitely do that. I know that, phase 1 was complex, and so from a capacity perspective, let's get finished with phase 1, and then let's figure out what we're gonna do with phase 2. We might have tried to bite off more than we could chew by trying to do some of them together, and I think we realized that let's get through 1 and then step back and look at phase 2. But one of the things that you have to remember is that these programs are dependent on the administration at hand. We saw 10 years ago when RAD came out, and we've seen over the last several years this push towards repositioning. That could change at any moment. In fact, there's already been some regulatory changes around some provisions of repositioning. And so I say that only to say if you wait too long, some of the advantages or some of the tools that are available today might not be available 12 months from now. And so you'd be looking at that a different slate of options to be able to work from. But yeah, absolutely. I would come back anytime between the months of March and November to do a work session.
Naomi, so one of the struggles being on the commission and reacting to resident and city members' concerns are the commission now has no oversight over Century Terrace and Harborview. So historically, the commission did. So it's been really difficult to be on the commission and relate that to citizens.
Sure.
Citizens have concerns that aren't being responded to or not responded to how they want them to be. So straight up, we now as a housing commission are completely hands-off Century Terrace and Harborview.
You are not completely hands-off because Riverside is acting as the property manager. You have the operational requirements. So you're managing the operations. Now, we're still working through some of the compliance aspects, okay? Because compliance and the ownership of the property are through a private entity.
Right, we know, we got that.
Okay. But if someone, there's nothing that ever prevents any one of the residents in Century Terrace or Harborview from coming to you and voicing a complaint or a concern. How it's addressed is going to be different because the structure is different. But if I were to come up to you as a Century Terrace resident, there's nothing that stops me from saying, I live at Century Terrace and my plumbing hasn't worked in 3 days. And then you as a Housing Commission board member, or you as a Housing Commission board, then direct your executive director, who is also the person that is running Riverside, to identify and address the issue through Riverside. Riverside is your entity, the Housing Commission's entity. And so there's an entire board structure there. So we might have added a couple of levels of, layers, but there's still a workflow and there's still a chain of command discussion. You're not completely hands off. Attorney's not going to kick me, is it? You're not completely out of the picture because again, you own the ground and you're the sole member of the property management agent, so you have that obligation and responsibility. And then through all the operational documents, there's all sorts of stuff that says, you get to do this, but someone's got to prove this. You get to do this, but someone has to prove this. But at the end of the day, from a working perspective, Clint and Lindsay are managing the property and managing the concerns. So I don't want to absolve you of any responsibility at Century Terrace and Harborview.
No,
We
we
don't want to be absolved.
right.
Yeah.
We feel that there is a piece that we still need to kind of provide oversight to.
Yeah, but it's remember, oversight of public housing and the housing authority and the housing commission's responsibility with your federal dollars in public housing, that is significantly different than the role and responsibility and oversight you now have for a tax credit project that has project-based rental assistance and RAD over it. if there's issues, HUD is still involved in this through the RAD contract, and so you still have to maintain compliance with the RAD contract. But when it comes to the IRS side, you aren't, Clint, Lindsay, or I'm not the ones that are responsible for compliance with the IRS piece of it. Okay, and that comes from the investor through the compliance entity that is overseeing the work that they're doing on that side. So you no longer have a single table that you're working at. You have 3 different tables, and you have to make sure that you can manage across those 3 tables. And that's a horrible analogy, but it's the only one that I could think of.
Yeah, I work in both federal and state businesses.
Yeah.
So I understand the complication.
Yeah, and now you're adding private because the entity that actually owns it is a private entity. It's not subject to Manistee Housing Commission FOIA acts or Manistee Housing Commission Open Meetings Act. I mean, the entity that actually owns it can have meetings every day, and they don't have to post them,
Right.
because they're a private entity. They're not a public entity or unit of local government.
In all of this, I appreciate it. It was a good overview and a good review of it. And again, just from my background, my profession, in all of these organizations, in all the complications, the individual people, the stress, the strain, we know that persons in poverty have more difficulties and more problems.
Yeah.
And these RAD conversions are not easy on them. And I want phase 2 to move smoother and more responsive to the people than the construction problems and everything that happened in phase 1.
I think any time you do something a second time or a third time or a fourth time, you get better at it. And again, this is not unusual. We have worked with housing authorities with as many as 6,500 units that have been converting properties since 2012 when this started. And every project is unique. Every project comes with its own challenges, but every time we go back, we get better and better. Oh, hey, don't forget we need to do X, Y, and Z because we didn't do that last time. Or we need to make sure that we identify this, we notify the residents these ways. I mean, you get better every time. So what you're witnessing as far as some of I like to call them speed bumps. The speed bumps in the process are not things that aren't experienced across the nation with housing authorities much larger than yours, with a lot more money and a lot more consultants. In fact, I would think for the most part, besides some operational challenges we're having, this one was actually pretty well done. We were able to get the RAD conversion piece done. Folks got to stay in their units for the most part, or in the property for the most part, if not in their own unit. And you got a really nice product at the end of the day. And that's what we strive to do.
Have you walked through the buildings while you were here? You didn't see any major concerns when you were walking through?
I don't like the color of carpet in Clint's office, but that's stuff like that. All joking aside, I think the conversion and the dollars, we initially had more improvements when we were planning this, but cost increases, you're constantly changing budgets. And so we might not have had all of the things that we wanted when we first set out to do this, but I think what you got at the end of the day is going to be a really good rehabilitation for, again, at little to no cost to the housing authority besides the stress and strain on the residents and the staff and the housing commission. But 6 months from now, when all this is finished and done, and you can look at testimonials from housing commissions and housing authorities that have gone through the same thing, testimonials from the residents overwhelmingly are positive.
I hope so.
Great.
So I know I talked a lot.
No?
Thanks.
Great
Thank you.
Questions,
Great
comments?
information.
I'm just going to turn it over to Jeff now. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jeff will correct everything I said wrong.
All right, good afternoon. My name is Jeff Klug, General Counsel for CMHC. A little bit about me. I have been working with low-income developers, low-income landlords for pretty much the whole time I've been practicing. Now I represent public housing authorities as well. So what is going on with the RAD conversion, any LIHTC conversion? These are pretty normal, standard when my client is doing that. When my client's not a public housing authority, they use LIHTC to try and LIHTC, low-income housing tax credits. That's what they use. That's the tool instrumentality that they get investors to come in so they can rehab their place, so they can provide better living for their residents, because at the end of the day, it is what it is for the residents. It is to provide them a better place to live. And my clients are always trying to find a better way to do that. And Rose, I really did appreciate everything you did say at the beginning, because me, as a landlord-tenant attorney representing the landlord, I do listen to the tenants as well. So their needs, their concerns, that's always something that we take into consideration. And whenever you're doing one of these, whether it be RAD conversion, LIHTC, there's going to be discomfort. There's going to be some people that are not happy because they're being relocated for a little bit. I mean, some of these buildings are so old. You got asbestos-containing materials. You got lead. You can't be in there when it's being done. You're tearing out the kitchen. You're tearing out their bathroom. They got to be somewhere else. So yes, there is that inconvenience. But at the end of the day, once they're back in there, we see it with the tenants, the residents, how happy they are, a lot better living quality for them and everything. So at the end of the day, it actually turns out to be so much better. And Naomi, that was a great presentation. You touched on a lot of it, and you touched on some of the things I was going to talk on too, which is completely fine. And with the residents, I know there's other concerns you have too. But what's happening with the Housing Commission now? We have all these other entities that are set up. Are we going to lose our subsidies? Are we losing anything? The short answer is no. It's not going to happen. And you two, and Karen and Virginia, mind if I call you by your first names,
Yep.
both of you?
No, that's great.
So you two are up here, and just like any of my other PHAs that are going through this, they're all thinking the same thing. This same structure is what PHAs use to get to rehab and to improve their facilities. Exactly what we're doing here. I wasn't involved in the actual reorganization and doing all these documents. That was Melissa Warden and her staff at Reno Kavanaugh. They do a great job. They've been doing this for a long time, very smart. And these documents and the organizational structure is not easy to understand. I mean, there's real estate attorneys that can't even touch this stuff. They can't even understand it. So I'll try and explain it in layman terms that I can to everybody here so we can get a good understanding of it. But the Housing Commission is not going away. It's staying. You guys still, number one, still own the real estate, and you still control the property management company, and with that, you guys are still the managing member. And I'm going to explain all that as I go on. But right now, as a commissioner of the Housing Commission, basically you meet once a month, you vote on resolutions, you pass resolutions, and your concern is to make sure that the mission statement is followed through. And the mission statement is to provide safe, decent, and sanitary housing conditions for very low-income families and manage the resources efficiently. And that's still, in the RAD conversion was presented to the board, and it was passed, and that's still being met. I paraphrase and brief the mission statement. There's more to it, but so that part of it is still being met with the RAD. The mission statement is still being carried out. The day-to-day operations of CMHC is for the executive director, which is Clint, and the day-to-day operations of the actual property management entity is still going to be oversaw by Clint. So that is still staying. You guys, the residents, if there's a problem, it's still going to be addressed by Clint and CMHC. That's not going away. And the commissioners, you're still going to stay. You're still going to be appointed by the city council. The mayor will appoint, city council approves. So that's not going away. Your commissioners, you're going to approve the executive director, and he or she is going to be the one that's going to manage the day-to-day operation of CMHC. But from here, I want to Naomi's presentation on page 17. She has a Century Terrace Harborview organization chart. And I'll try and I first want to go to Riverside Housing Inc., because an instrumentality, legal terms, we call it an instrumentality of CMHC. The reason why, well, if we look at the makeup of, step back, CMHC, how it acts, it's through its board. So you guys approve resolutions, because you're the commissioner. So that's how we act, we approve resolutions. Same thing with Riverside Housing, Inc. is a nonprofit entity, organization, corporation. So how it acts, it has directors, and it has bylaws just as CMHC does. Its bylaws provide for 5 board of directors. The board of directors consists of one of them is the executive director, the other one is the deputy director, and then we have the president of CMHC's board, the vice president of the board, and then another director appointed by the president. So it's essentially almost the exact same as the CMHC's board. You guys you still vote on resolutions for CMHC, which then kind of flow through to Riverside. So it's not completely gone.
Who appoints this board? Or is this board made up of people who choose to be on that?
You're talking about the,
Riverside,
said who appoints the board?
Yeah.
It's stated in the bylaws that were approved.
I think, you're no,
For us.
Riverside,
I'm
no.
not part of Riverside.
The mayor appoints CMHC. There is no appointment process specifically for Riverside. It's made up of your chair and vice chair from the CMHC board, your executive director, deputy executive director, and then a 5th member who is chosen by the chair of Riverside.
Okay.
And that's stated in Riverside's bylaws, which the bylaws cannot be changed unless it's by unanimous consent, I believe, of the board of directors. I don't even know.
By amendment of the Board of Directors of Riverside.
Yeah, I don't think it's unanimous consent. though.
Yeah,
Okay.
by majority.
By majority, but still, it would have to be, CMHC would have to approve the amendment of the bylaws to change that, the directors.
Jeff, that is not how Melissa has had it run.
What are you talking about with?
There's been an amendment, and it's only Riverside that had to approve the amendment.
Correct, but Riverside, in order to approve it, you have to, the board of directors have to approve
The Board of Directors of Riverside.
Correct.
Right. I thought you said of CMHC.
No, but I said it's made up of, there's 4 of CMHC, so you would have to, that's how it'd be amended, but there's still, you have the executive director, deputy director, and you have the president and vice president of the board who are served, plus a 5th member. And that's a common, structure that I see with the nonprofits for PHAs in order to do that. So the structure is not anything unusual I've seen. It's exactly the same structure I've seen with the other PHAs that I've worked with, who are going through rad conversions.
And excuse me, just one question on those. So we haven't seen anything from meetings of that, and you're just appointed as the vice chair.
No, treasurer.
Who's the vice chair of the commission now?
Jim Bond.
Oh, okay. So is that group have meetings and report meetings, or don't necessarily have to do that?
They don't have to report them to us.
They have to have meetings, it's specified in the bylaws. There's special meetings and there's at least an annual meeting, and then there's special meetings that can be called as well. Clint, if you know the exact.
It's meetings that are, excuse me, called as necessary, but we have to meet once a year for the annual, meeting.
Correct.
But that's all that's required.
Yeah.
And there isn't any requirement in the bylaws of reporting back to CMHC.
So that's, you have, every corporation, nonprofit, state of Michigan, all it requires is to have at least just one annual meeting, and then they get special meetings that, it's usually a majority of the directors, if they request, then you can go ahead and you can have a special meeting to come and discuss.
That's our disconnect a little bit. If Riverside's gonna be out there and they're doing their meetings, which has 4 or 5 of our members, but it's not, there's no communication flow. So
Okay.
it's just a process problem that I see.
Okay. So the process problem you see is more of not sharing the information between Riverside Housing, Inc. and CMHC.
Yeah, it should be a more, again, just used to different things, but a more fluid process instead of silo. You know, I think we have a little bit of silos going, and that's the feeling that comes across, that we don't have any type of input into Riverside. Not that we want to manage it, we have a person that's managing, but to be able to understand what's going on, you know. I know that Clint, you know, I'll bring up the construction problem again, you know, it's like you've been dealing with nothing but headaches, and, you know, we get little bits and pieces of that, but it would be nice to kind of know better about, okay, where are we at, what are we doing? So it's just a process thing that we'll just have to work on, I guess.
Because the entities, yeah, it is two separate entities. You know,
Yeah.
you have the nonprofit and you have CMHC. Even though that the board, the directors for the nonprofit are all, besides maybe the one appointed, are all board members or executive directors but that's just the structure that has to be done for the LIHTC side of it. But if you look at it, and I'm going up on page 17 of Naomi's presentation, she has the owner entity of CTHV Limited Dividend Housing Association LLC. So that's a limited liability company, and that's made up of two people, and you got, well, two entities. One's the investor member, and I know everybody looks at that and they're like, oh, you got a 99.99%, they control everything. But that investor member, they're just solely investing. They're not in the management of it. The managing member, that's the one who makes all the decision. That is CTHV Managing Member LLC. And that entity is made up of, it keeps going down. I know these are kind of, you got a big, huge structure going here, but that's made down of CTHV Riverside LLC, and they are the managing members, so they control that. They make the day-to-day decisions, and that is still going to that, and then that is owned by Riverside Housing. So the actual properties, the management, the control, I know, you know, the board of directors aren't 100% the same, but it flows, it's an instrumentality of CMHC, because you have your board, you pick the board. The board has to be from here besides the one that the executive director can choose. And that is, and I understand some of the, you know, these are the exact same issues and concerns that my other PHAs are having. And I know that phase 2 was mentioned. There's a lot of good that can become of the phase 2. I've seen some where they're selling off, but they're actually keeping the ones they sell are going to be still Section 8 and low income, and they're using the money to completely build more low income housing.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot of neat different tools you can do with the help of you know, Naomi and other people to help with that. But pertaining to the actual organizational structure, is there anything else? Any other questions, or no?
No?
Yes.
How long are the appointments for Riverside?
For Riverside, I'll take a look at the bylaws, but I don't think there's not.
I think the appointments run concurrent with the appointment to either the CMHC board or the employment as the executive director and deputy executive director.
Yeah, that's usually how it is, because it would be the president of the board is then on is the director of the nonprofit, and then when the new executive director comes in, they're obviously have full executive.
So the community member at large, though, is it connected to an employment status for a term on the housing commission? Is there a term for that added position that was
It's just
put in?
unless they got amended the bylaws, but usually the bylaws I'll say the president would then be able to appoint it. So if there's a new executive director, he or she would be the president, and he or she could appoint a new director.
So that person just serves at the discretion of the
the
housing
board.
commission director.
Correct, that's one vote out of 5.
Now, one thing I'd like to point out, Karen was asking about the makeup of the Riverside Board. And 2 are the president, vice president of the Housing Commission. The other 2 are employees of the Housing Commission, which gives the control roundabout back to the Housing Commission, because the Housing Commission could decide to fire these 2 people and replace them with a new executive director and deputy director, because the management wasn't what it was supposed to be.
Correct.
Okay.
That's,
Well, but to clarify, the Housing Commission could only choose to fire the executive director. The executive director is responsible for hiring and firing staff.
Okay.
correct, yeah.
But yes, the idea is that even through the subsidiary entity, the Housing Commission retains control. And that's so that you don't, there's actually instances, a few in Texas, everything's bigger in Texas, we also do things worse in Texas too. Couple of instances where housing authorities created what's called an affiliate, not an instrumentality. And so the majority of the membership was not in the control of the Housing Commission, and they veered off course. And those affiliates then started going, well, these are our properties, it's our money, we're gonna do whatever we want, we're not controlled by you guys anymore. And in fact, in one specific instance, the executive director of the housing authority was fired, but the affiliate had created new bylaws that allowed him to remain on the affiliate and in control of assets and dollars.
That's my concern.
Yeah, and that has not happened here with that situation. I haven't
Well,
seen one.
it hasn't happened yet.
Well, and the control is such that 4 or 5, actually 5 members are under control of the Housing Commission. You won't have that because you're chair and vice chair directly from the board, and then the staff that's hired by the board and or the executive director.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. It's,
Steve Foster.
So that, what you said, couldn't actually happen in this structure because we have all these other agreements. You can't just create another affiliate and, for instance, as example, or Clint would form another nonprofit where he's sole, he's the one that controls everything, and then all of a sudden he's the property manager. No, we have, I mean, there's a lot of contracts with here. When CMHC submitted its RAD paperwork, it was 800 to 900, maybe more pages. You got property management agreement, which specifies who the property manager is. And so you have that one. Yeah, I mean, there's many documents. You got operating agreements between all these entities. Each one of these, you have separate operating agreements. I mean, I think the main operating agreement alone is over usually about 130 pages. So you can't just, so that concern that it shouldn't be a concern, that can't happen.
But as the president of Riverside, he could say that as president, he can't be replaced even though he loses his job.
No.
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 The bylaws are structured so that if you're not a board member, or you don't work there, you're not.
But I think it already went from a 4-person board to a 5.
It is you're talking about the
Riverside?
Riverside.
It's always been set up as it's.
Yeah.
It's always been a 5?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
from the get-go.
But Riverside can't change their own bylaws without,
Yes, they can.
You'd have to go through the whole process to do it, and
They can amend it.
they can't do anything and change its bylaws which would cause it to breach any of the other contracts that they're in. That's the other concern. They can't just sit there and change the bylaws and say, the executive director of CMHC is the director of everything. It's the president, vice president, secretary, it's every position on the board for Riverside.
so Clinton as president of Riverside can't say, I'm king now, no one can touch me.
He can say it.
Okay.
It won't
He
matter.
always has somebody to report to, and he
Yeah.
still does. He's still got the board to report to. And he still has to, so CMHC, that's why it's not going away. And CMHC owns the property at the end of the compliance period. Riverside's gonna own the first phase is gonna own the building, and then it's gonna turn back to CMHC then.
So I just want to clarify, because it was my understanding that Riverside originally was Clinton, Lindsay, the chair and vice chair of the Housing Commission, and that those bylaws were amended by
Yes.
Riverside to bring a 5th board member in. So my concern is, if they can do that, can he amend again and have more board members, and now you don't have a controlling vote from the Housing Commission at Riverside? Am I misunderstanding that, Clinton? Was that not amended to add a fifth?
It was amended by Reno and Kavanaugh so that we would end up having a tiebreaker and be able to have a person serve as a treasurer of the Riverside Housing. So we added a officer position of a treasurer. Those all were written and handled by Reno and Kavanaugh to be sure that everything was in line with all the other contracts of the RAD conversion deal. I can.
So Riverside
So to
bylaws
your
were
point,
amended.
so they
Yes.
were amended, the bylaws can be amended by a majority vote of the board, not a single person.
Right.
And so the majority of the board is controlled by, all of the board is controlled by the housing commission. The chair, vice chair, the person they hire, and the person that person hires, plus be appointed by the chair. Now,
So the single
it-
person brought in from the community cannot affect the
Well, I'm not
entire.
worried about personally.
And
So you,
you shouldn't be worried about me either.
Riverside was comprised solely of all CMHC board members. CMHC board members could change the bylaws so that it had nothing to do with CMHC. There's nothing that prevents the board of Riverside from amending the bylaws. But the fact that the majority, if not all, the board members of Riverside are CMHC board and or staff means that the mission of CMHC should flow through the mission of Riverside, right? But even if it was all 5 the same members, all 5 of the CMHC board members could go, yeah, we're gonna amend Riverside, and we're gonna say we're not doing any affordable housing, and we're gonna go buy, used car lots.
But they
Well, and that's
still would
been brought
have,
up in these meetings
Yeah.
before.
But then, to
So-
Jeff's point,
they still have to comply with all of the other
Yes.
agreements they do that. So if they do something where, that would breach any of those, then you have, obviously, the investing, member would have a cause of action if he did anything where the tax credits would flow through to that member. If he did anything that would cause the nonprofit to not be a nonprofit. And the other one to not fulfill it being a affordable housing, that would be a breach of it. So they can't do amend bylaws to breach contracts to not be affordable housing, low income housing.
Again, Ginny and I are new to the board, and my impression, and I have been in numerous boards throughout the county here, is that as this conversion started and this process started, probably the communication was not effective enough for lay people to understand. It's, like you said, it's a very difficult process. And when we get on the board, after all this, we're asking questions.
Sure.
How did you get to this? Why is this person? How did that happen? So I think that some of all of this is opening an opportunity for many community members to now speak up and say, wait a minute, how's that happening and how's that happening? So it gives a veil of uncertainty from our community. And for my own self, I'm pushing about transparencies. So, at the same time that our leadership, our management group is going through all the complications of having to do, face what they're facing every day with construction and stuff. So this is a issue. There's multi-issues here, and that's why there's all these conversations and communications. That's why I'm already worried about phase 2, because again, I'm a mental health provider, 35 years in the business, and I can tell you people in poverty have difficulties with these transitions when there's no communication with them. And again, they're an oppressed population. So I'm charged with advocacy for that group. So that's why I'm already asking the question, what are we going to do? How are we going to communicate? I'm already bugging Clint about that. it's like, we got to do this better. We got to let them know. We got to talk in their language. There's just a lot of pieces to this. And I'm speaking for myself, but being on this board, it's a learning curve. Even though I've done housing for 20 years, it's still complex.
and you're, unfortunately, you're behind the 8 ball.
Yep.
Because we've been doing this for 4 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
And even Clint and Lindsay are reliant upon Jeff's and Melissa's to do a lot of that. I talk about the legal stuff, but I'm still gonna turn to the attorneys at the end of the day and say, you guys know why we're doing this, figure out why we're doing this. Much less some, coming to a meeting once every while and going, what? You just, so I do get that it's complicated. I do also think you have to have some level of comfort with the people that are doing what they're doing to make sure that they're doing it right. Because it's gonna be hard for the layperson to know if what he's saying is true or not, right? And everything is a little different. So know though that your consultants, for a small or higher fee if you're an attorney, are always available for you to be able to help share information and then help you disperse and dispense that information to the public.
Well, since we've got on and we're new, and I think a lot of people weren't getting reactions from the previous members of the commission that they expect us to have, and with CMH, I've been with housing for 30 years, tax credit, Section 8, done it all. They want us to produce more results. And we have been told since we got on that we're not allowed in Century Terrace or Harborview buildings, and we don't oversee issues in those buildings. We're only overseeing scattered sites. So there's been an extreme frustration from the perspective of coming on, being appointed by the city as a commissioner, and then being told back off. So you can see why it's been difficult and we're constantly being contacted by members of the community, which we're open to, we want to be. But if we can't provide solutions or answers or get results, it's extremely frustrating position.
So I would, and I know I'm just jumping in on Jeff's time, and I apologize for,
Jeff's like, great.
part of the majority of my 25 years in housing was as executive director for housing authorities across the U.S., mainly in Texas, but outside of Texas. And so I've sat in that position, and I've worked with my boards through this. I think one of the things that you as a board want to be cautious about is making sure that you act as a board, because you do have a risk when individual board members go beyond that board protection. And so it's the same thing if board members of CMHC are seen as or perceived as potentially interfering in the business of the private corporation that now owns the property, right? I don't think anyone wants you to be, I don't think the intention is that you're hands off, but there are levels of protection that are put in place to ensure that individuals don't violate the sanctity of the board envelope. Because you could be, and again, I defer to the attorney on this, but you could be putting yourself at personal risk or liability if you take actions that are not board actions, right? And so when I do board trainings and HUD trainings, I always talk about the body has to act as a body. So if the body of the Housing Commission is asked to produce results, then the Housing Commission as a body has to authorize steps from your staff to do what the body needs. New members, you are at a disadvantage because you're new to the board, you're new to the structure, and now you're new to this whole RAD thing. So now you've got a board and you've got a subsidiary board, two of which you don't even sit on because of the formation of that board for the tax credit purposes. And so it is a challenge to navigate all that. But I think that between the board, Clinton, your various counsel and consultants, we can develop mechanisms that allow you to get the information you need to be able to understand what's going on, but also to authorize your executive director or your president of Riverside, whatever it is, to enact those policies and procedures and then provide you with results. And when someone says results, looking at this from the outside, I think you guys have done a fantastic job. I think you've got great physical results. Could there have been improvements? Always. And we have an ongoing list of, we should have done this better, we should have said this way. Next time, let's do this on a bulletin board instead of through notices, or next time, let's do notices and bulletin boards and mail it out. And so we're looking at ways to improve so that the communication between all parties is better. But I just want to just make sure that, from a board perspective, if the board wants something, the board needs to ask for it. it shouldn't be individuals. And if anyone's coming to you as an individual, you should direct them back to the board, and the board then takes the next steps. Would you, yeah, no, maybe?
For the majority of it, I would agree. I mean, I would still say that you are all serving as commissioners of CMHC. The mission statement's still there. Now, CMHC is not managing, Sedgwick Terrace and Harborview. Riverside Housing Inc. is. If somebody comes up to you, if a resident comes up to you with a concern or anything, that's something you can definitely address at the board meetings. You can address it with Clint. Those are concerns for CMHC. We own the property, CMHC does. And it's still part of its mission statement. So if there are any concerns regarding it, I would say yes, those can definitely be brought up and those should be addressed. And that's how I've always taken it. But I mean, as Naomi said, there are instances where, there could be things that if you step outside, could open up not yourself to liability, but CMHC up to liability, because if you do something that, if you did something that would breach one of the contracts, example, that could open up CMHC to liability. So there's something like that where you would have to be careful, but taking into consideration any residents, any of their concerns, questions, that's still part of your responsibilities as commissioners, and it's still part of your duties and responsibilities as commissioners to have addressed with the executive director, because overall the executive director is the president of Riverside. So that is still there, and that's not going away. And there is nothing that Clint or any additional executive director could do. It still has to be a nonprofit, that entity, and it still has to comply with all the contracts that essentially which are written.
I understand that, I do, but there is a general distrust in the community over what's happening there. What's been happening for probably the last 10 years. The RAD conversion, I think, is a fantastic thing.
I think that is part of an issue that even in my time on this commission, and I am one of our county commissioners as well. So this is my district where these two buildings are at. And I think that since I've been on this board, and of course a county commission runs very differently than a housing commission, but I think we've improved a little bit in our process. When I first came on, I was a little concerned. We had 20-minute meetings, and I know that probably, and everybody else that's not here been on this board for a long time, so they're used to things. But as a board, we need to realize that you might have to back up a little bit because you have new members, and everybody has to be on the same page, not just two members making decisions with the managing organization. The board has to be involved.
And I definitely agree with you on that one. And this whole process with the RAD conversion is something that's definitely not easy to understand.
Yeah, we put that on top of everything else, and I think that level of, questioning, concerns, dissatisfaction, on top of stress and strains, not only the residents. I know that Lindsay and Clint and everybody have felt it, but it is an emotional hotbed, putting all this together and then trying to communicate with people. I just want RAD 2 to be smoother. So I will constantly be on that one.
Any questions?
But why were the housing commissioners told that they couldn't be on the property?
They weren't told they couldn't be on the property. I think what Ginny is referring to is that we held a resident meeting in which Riverside wanted to hear from the residents. And it was Bill Gamble did the hosting of the meeting, taking questions and such. And then we had the two commissioners who serve on the Riverside board present at the meeting also, so that they could hear the resident issues, and we could begin dealing with the issues that related to construction, related to relocation, and everything else, in that. So that was the purpose of the meeting. It was a Century Terrace, Riverside meeting to hear residents of Century Terrace and to address those needs. And we wanted it not to be, it wasn't to be a public meeting.
And the other thing that wasn't supposed to be subject to Open Meetings Act as well. That may be another thing too, because once you have a quorum, and you're gonna sit there and start deliberate discussion, that's subject to Open Meetings Act.
But if a resident invited me into their home to talk with me, that's okay.
Yeah.
Yes, we never said you guys can't come on the property.
You
did tell
when I was with Vanessa, you did tell me when I.
You did tell us both.
And I would actually disagree, because as a board member, I would not recommend that you are doing direct resident communications. You have an executive director. Now, if someone contacts you, emails you, or even says, come in and see this mold, that's one thing. But
That's what they did.
as a single individual of the board, if you get a complaint, you bring it to the board meeting, and then the board directs the executive director to take the next steps.
But the last few agendas have said Century Terrace and Harbor View are not to be brought up at the Housing Commission meetings, correct?
Because Century Terrace and Harborview are under a different entity. They're owned by Riverside. So now you have a different entity, a different structure.
So I'm confused though, if you said they've heard a complaint from a resident, which I'm assuming Harbor View or Century Terrace, they should bring it back to the board, but they're being told that Century Terrace and Harbor View aren't points of discussion at the board meetings.
I think she's talking about the actual agendas and resolutions
Yeah.
specifically. for those
Yeah.
properties.
I think,
It's not hard.
I think some of that,
It's-
like, people can make a complaint, but I think that what we've gotten into, that is something that we try to, okay, so-and-so, but I'd send it over to Clinton to see if they'll manage it or take care of it. But, so some of that's happening on the side, not the majority or anything, and it's not everybody on the email. It's just like if something happened, I send you a message, this is what's happened. So we do kind of communicate when those, things, it's hit and miss, sometimes too. People want you to kind of deal with something right away, but, there's processes too.
And I think putting in place, I think you started, or maybe you've drafted, I don't remember, putting in place a process and procedures manual for how those things happen is a good idea, especially because you do have two different entities and two different boards. And even though CMHC appoints and hires, you do have different lines of control. And I think that's where the confusion is arising. Because you have two board members here that aren't on the Riverside board, but you're still gonna hear things from folks in the community. So developing some sort of process or protocol for, okay, if someone comes to you and gives you a complaint, what are the next steps? Do you then forward it to the chair and vice chair? Do you bring it up to the board and say, here's the Riverside complaints I have, Riverside board, go take care of that, bring back a report? That's the kind of thing that I think you.
Well, and I think what's not being said too is that the complaints brought forth, Jenny, have been anonymous and then not shared with us so that management could do its job to rectify the issues. And if you're going to bring the board of the Housing Commission issues that need to be addressed by the managing agent of CTHV, we need to know who we need to work with to resolve issues. And so to hear we have X number of complaints about XYZ and not know who it is, our hands are tied. And both Lindsay and I have heard that, and we don't know how to resolve an issue that we don't even know what the issue really is, so we can find out what's going on and make it right. Who's it caused by? What caused the issue? Whatever. That's not being said here, and it needs to be brought out that if we know what the issue is, we do resolve it. If we don't know what the issue is and who it relates to, it cannot be resolved, because there may be portions of the story you don't know, or there may be portions of the story we don't know. We need to investigate and find a resolution.
That's the piece that I would encourage, the last comment you made is we need to investigate. I'm in the same boat. 120 employees, I sit down with a group of them, people tell me things, and they don't always want to say who's telling them this. They're the representatives. So it's my job to go out and investigate it. And I do not blow off comments and questions or concerns. If they say somebody's doing this, I'm going to be very mindful to watch that. Now, whether it's true or not, I'm going to have to find that out. And I don't always get their names. People, get scared. And again, we are dealing with a population of people who are underserved and discredited, and there's biases towards them. And, they're struggling with their own financial, mental health, disabilities, all that stuff. So it's not easy for them to come up and say, I got a complaint. I mean, that's why people like me are employed, to say, this person, has a concern, this is a complaint. I mean, we've got persons that we help to represent
But
there.
the mental health people can also go to the representative that is supposed to do the full investigation. I forget the actual technical name of the Department of Health and Human Services, which I have had to contact in the past because of my sister. So there is a separate body within your investigation that can do all that and can pursue all that information.
There is,
It's Lindsay and I.
And I'm glad that you were able to maneuver that system.
It's a difficult system.
It's a very difficult system. It's like a rad conversion, I can tell you.
I think ultimately, though, the whole goal is that if a resident has a complaint, there has to be a process that allows for that complaint to be resolved. And that process, however it's developed or designed, has to be designed so that both parties can present both sides of the information. Because, for example, if a resident complains to HUD assigns someone to investigate from what the resident is saying, and also with the Housing Commission or Housing Authority and other related parties. And here, it doesn't sound like there is an entity or an individual that can do that. So I think, next steps for somewhere, there has to be somewhere where residents have to understand that anonymous complaints are not as easily resolved as telling folks who you are, but the more transparent your residents are about who they are, the more people that know about it, when an investigation is done and the results are shared, then there is a true understanding of the circumstances as well as this can be shared around that.
And I think that's the bottom line. The more the results are shared, the more it's discussed, the more that you're out there looking at it and giving the people the feeling that they are being heard, the more they'll step up and be more vocal.
I think there's also some onus that has to be placed on the resident. Residents have to understand that as much as it scares them, they have to make their voice known in who they are. They can't just complain anonymously, because it really is difficult if you get a complaint that says a resident wasn't happy with construction. That is way too broad for anyone to address. But if a resident in Unit 401 wasn't happy because a construction person on Monday came in and used their bathroom without their permission, that's a much easier problem to investigate and to resolve. So, looking to the resident advocates and Rose and helping to express that to the residents and get them more comfortable with sharing, either with Rose and or management staff, I think is also going to be part and parcel of the partnership working together.
Well, I think it's going to be important that we get back to, it's in here, Jenny and I both underline our resident counselor.
There's no resident council, it's in your outline.
So it certainly, I think that'll be a place where you'll get voices, and then as communication just builds,
So when
more
you say
trust.
there's no resident council in the outline, you mean on the board?
No, you said that in your outline that there's a resident council.
They have, yes, the resident council absolutely has the ability to form and organize and get funded.
And so that has to happen.
Doesn't exist.
Okay, and then again, residents have to step up and do that.
Yeah,
I
well,
mean-
people like Rose and them can,
But Rose is not a resident of the property,
no, but
right?
she works with some
Yeah.
residents, she can
So-
inform it's an opportunity.
Yeah, and the residents absolutely, just like they can in public housing. And I think it's actually $25 per occupied per unit per year is set aside, and so the resident council can utilize those funds for training, for advocacy, for things like that, and that absolutely
Yeah,
is there.
we didn't know.
But if the residents don't form a resident council, then the housing commission can't force them to form a resident
No,
council.
but maybe nobody knew that opportunity existed.
I think we've
Well,
had
we've
them in the
had
past.
resident councils,
Yeah,
and-
it just kind of, it dwindled, and
And
so
Dale
it's,
spoke about that when we had the meeting at Century Terrace and encouraged people to step up and work on and ask some people directly to be part of a resident council formation team.
Yeah, because, I mean, the resident council is similar to the board in the sense that you gotta have bylaws, you gotta have officers, you gotta have open elections. It can't just be a hand-picked group of people, right? In order to actually be a HUD-recognized resident council, you have certain steps. And I don't know about you, when I was in an apartment, I didn't want to talk to anybody. And the majority of people in apartment complexes don't necessarily communicate with others or get involved. And so it can be tough in general to get residents involved and residents
yeah.
involved in a significant way.
It's all a process. I have a son that's in Roanoke, Virginia, working in a housing project, so what he does is amazing, and people will participate.
Yeah.
So complaints, in my opinion, are very broad. Are we talking about complaints just for construction and the RAD thing, or are we talking about complaints pertaining to other
Health and
residents
safety,
their-
health and safety issues.
Health and safety issues, so with the, after the RAD or prior to?
Just prior
Prior
and
and-
during.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've probably seen the stats on the bed bug issue and things like that, which is a big concern.
That is a big concern, yeah, obviously the bed bugs, but that's not just, obviously with PHAs, we have to do request for proposals, and we have to use those, that company that who was it? Is it
Bid
Griffin?
system.
It was Griffin, and then Riverside changed to using Rose.
And all of my clients have issues with bed bugs. It's not uncommon, and the reason is, I mean, as a lot of them, PHAs, very low income residents, and sometimes they're just bringing furniture usually off the street and everything, they'll have bed bugs in it, but the residents also have to cooperate in order to treat that. There's issues with some residents that are hoarders, and they will not get rid of their stuff, so that can't be treated. And then it ends up spreading. So, and then in those instances, we can't just go in there, we being the public housing authority, we can't just go into that person's unit and treat it. We have to go through the court process, which that has not been easy, and depending on where you're at. I don't do landlord tenants up here, so I don't know what your district judges do. But some of them will not evict, will not let anybody in, and even, and my clients don't want to evict, they want to treat, but even that, you still have to get the cooperation of the tenant almost 99% of the time. So it is a long process for those are not quick and easy. I don't know how backlogged it is, but where I practice with landlord tenant, file a complaint, you're lucky to get in within 3 months.
I just want to make, when bed bugs come up every time, I just always have to make this point, is that probably in places like Century Terrace or Harborview, it's congregate living, so you have more likelihood for spread. But they are throughout the community. I can be at Myers, I could be at Family Fair, my kids can go to school. It's all through the community, and I just don't want it to think that it's only Century Terrace that has this problem.
No, I'm not, and I'm saying that's just, it happens to all of my clients who, even market rate. It doesn't have to be low income, it just happens. And
Right.
It's hard to treat because a lot of times sometimes the residents will not cooperate, and you need the residents to cooperate. And you also need to go through the legal process, which takes a long time.
So if I can give you a horror story from Fort Worth, before I became executive director there, they had a building downtown, 13-story, called Hunter's Plaza. Elderly disabled building. It got so overrun with bed bugs, they had to move everybody out and encapsulate the whole building and
Yeah.
treat the whole building. Had to move everybody out. And it was then a rad conversion, and residents got to come back. But I mean, to your point, bed bugs have been an issue for years, but they are also everywhere. It's just often easier to treat when you're in a hotel situation and you know people are moving out versus residents who, even if they move out, if you don't treat everything that they have, they don't have very much, they bring it back, and it's difficult. And HUD ties your hands with regards to evicting people and treating them and charging them for bed bugs. They're bigger in Texas, yeah, even the bed bugs.
Any other
Thank you.
questions? Or?
Thank you. It's helped.
Andy?
Poor Andy.
Sorry, Andy, we talked too much.
Yeah, long time coming. I'm Andy Zink, I'm the auditor for the Housing Commission. I've been auditing housing commissions, I guess, for 25 years, so got quite good experience with it. And I guess I've been doing this one for about 10 years. And in general, I've never had any issues or any complaints, and rarely have any findings. So it's always been a good process. The staff has always been helpful. You know, if I want something, they give it to me, and there's always good clarification on most of the items I ask for. So my audit report's 51 pages.
Yeah.
And I should say my audit report, it's the Housing Commission's audit report. So I'm only required to comment on the first 2 pages, my audit report, and state an opinion. The remaining 49 pages are the Housing Commission's responsibility, or the Housing Commission's financial data. So I work with them in accumulating and assisting them in getting them proper presentation. So the remaining pages are reported like HUD wants, like it's supposed to be for GAAP, and all the required documents. So for fiscal year 21, you know, there were some changes. And, you know, RAD had the biggest part, you know, in making the process a little bit more challenging, changing some of the balances by large numbers, but that's expected, that's common. That's, you know, that's what's going to happen when you convert to RAD. So nothing unusual was going on. It was just the fact that these were going to be changes that had to be done, and we had to record them. So the first 2 pages, you know, is my audit report where I state my opinion, and what you're looking for is an unqualified opinion, or an opinion that's, you know, stating that there's no changes, it's fairly presented, you know, and I had that. I made some journal entries, or we made some changes to the financial statements, mainly to do to RAD, but any of those changes were made, and I think everything's been now presented in accordance with GAAP and properly presented. On page 3, we've got what's called management discussion and analysis. So what that is that's management's comments and discussion on the financial data. And if you look at it, it says unaudited, because I didn't audit that. That is, in a sense, you know, comments made by management, verbatim, information reported by changes, and I can't audit that. I mean, that's not where I can state an opinion. So that's why it says unaudited. Plus, it's coming from management. Financial highlights for the year: the net position increased, and of course, this was mainly due to the RAD conversion. Cash also increased from the prior year. The Commission's total revenues also increased from the prior year. And expenses did increase by a smaller amount, but they did increase. Revenues increased by $2.7 million. So on that $2.7 million, the majority, or almost all of it, is attributed to the sale of the building to the new entity. And what happens is that new entity then takes that building and performs or gives all the tax credits out. So then now all the Housing Commission is left with is 48 units, their vehicles, some other hard assets, things like that. The middle of the page, on page 3, it says required financial statements, explains what the Housing Commission is supposed to put in their reports, you know, explain current revenue changes, current expense changes, things like that. Moving to page 4, then it's giving you the differences and balances from one year to the next. So we're looking at 2021 compared to 2020, the changes. And of course, the biggest change would be in total assets. And then total liabilities also changed. You had one large debt of about $1 million that was paid off, the EPC loan. When you sold the properties, that loan was paid off, and it was required to be paid off. So that went away. So then your total net position for the year increased by $2.6 million. Moving down the page, in page 4 explains RAD and what went on with RAD. Explains how the net increase in capital assets, it explains the decrease in your loans, like I just explained. Also talks about how current assets increased and current liabilities decreased. So a lot of good things went on with the RAD conversion on your financial statements. You got rid of some debt, but you also got rid of the 2 buildings there, but that's part of the process. On page 5, it goes on to explain changes with revenues and expenses. And of course, you can see the biggest change on page, or in the top of the page there, on other revenue. It says other revenue went up $2.6 million. So in the conversion of getting rid of the building, you had a $2.7 million gain. Total expenses went up $130,000, which is fairly reasonable. The largest amount of that is due to administrative, health insurance costs, things like that. Some salaries increases maybe, and other expenses. And I think some legal fees also were probably attributed to that. Jumping to page 6 then, it lists the changes by program. You got your public housing program, your CARES program, and then the total amount of revenue for the 2 programs. Change in net position again is the $2.6 million, which is change from revenue to expenses. So overall, it was a positive result. You did have the Women Domestic Violence Program also, some tenant revenue, and then also your state and local program, which is a negative balance for the year, which is attributed to less money coming in. Going to page 7, it says revenues. In reviewing revenues and expenses, you note some diagrams with the funding. You can see how tenant revenue makes up 25% of the total process. Grant funding, of course, is the 61%, and other revenues 14%. And once again, other revenue, that was attributed to the sale of the property. And you also had the EPC loan that was forgiven, like I stated prior. Expenses in a diagram went from $1.8 million in 2021, an increase of $130,291. Below the diagram, it breaks down the changes of the major accounts. Administrative increased, tenant services decreased, only a small amount. Utilities increased, maintenance cost decreased, general expenses increased by $11,000, and then depreciation also decreased. Going to page 9, talking about capital assets. You can see how the building, of course, went down. When the buildings were sold, that reduced the buildings by $7.9 million. So your accumulated building costs that you had in the buildings for those 2 buildings was roughly $7.9 million over a 50-year period or 60-year period, however old they are. Some leasehold improvements were in those buildings also, so that was included, and that's the reason that balance went down by $91,000. So the total change in capital assets after all the modifications was 1.46 million. Going down to the bottom of the page, it just breaks down another change in capital assets for the year. Page 10, you have your long-term liabilities. And what that is that's a state program funding that has been on the books. You, over a period of time, will get that forgiven as long as you participate in the program. Also, you can see where the previous energy program had the loan balance on there. That was wiped down to zero when that was paid off. Total interest, it's stating for the year, which included the most of the year on this EPC loan, which is no longer there, was $60,000. So that interest expense will totally be gone, I believe, at this point. You don't have any other debt, that only minor amounts that you'd be paying interest on. Then it's got in the middle of the page, on page 10, it says economic factors, budget deficiencies, healthcare costs, the subsidy that HUD pays out, of course, it was always changing. So, and then there's a brief comment on the Housing Commission, how revenues increased and expenses only increased by a small percentage. And then final financial contact, if people were interested in contacting, who to contact at the Housing Authority. So that was the MD&A part. I'm going to touch on the financial reports, these three, and then go to the footnotes. Got your total current assets broke down between cash, due from other governments, accounts receivable, prepaids, and then your non-current assets, which is mainly made up of the buildings that are left, and the note receivable, which is the balance of the amount when you sold the building. You've got total current liabilities of $243,000 and total non-current liabilities of $434,000. And then you break down your net position, which is basically similar to your retained earnings of $4.5 million. Jumping to the statement of revenue and expenses, you've got operating revenues of $2 million, operating expenses of $1.75 million. So your operating income was $295,000. Then you've got your special item, the $2.4 million, which is your building that was sold, some interest expense. So your total change in net position is a $2.6 million to come down for an end of year net position of $4.5 million again.
Can I ask, tenant services, back here it had a description of social services provided. Tenants, what is that?
Which-
Tenant services.
Under MD&A,
It's on page 8. Include all costs incurred by a commission to provide social services to the resident? And
That's
that's
at
it.
$25 per person, per occupied unit per year.
For the council thing that we
It could
talked
be
about?
for the council, but it could be also for other, services that are offered.
Okay.
tenant services is multiple things though.
Right.
I mean, but that's just one of them, correct?
Mhm.
So.
Thank you.
On page 13, we got statement of cash flows. The one positive, or what you always want to have, is net cash provided by operations. So net cash provided by operations is $500,000, which is great. Anytime you're operating and having positive cash flow, that's the best, especially for a governmental or a nonprofit. It's sometimes a difficult process, but that's definitely what you want. You've got net cash used by capital activities, so spending some money to pay down debt, interest, acquiring a small amount of capital assets. That was a negative $125,000, common. So your overall net cash increase was $376,000 for the year to be 1.9, so the total cash then at the end of the year was 1.29 million. And one thing to comment on is these financial statements include the nonprofit. So the nonprofit is a component unit of the Housing Commission, okay? So they're financially intertwined. There's a lot of activity between them. There are employment agreements between them. So there's contracts with them, you know, things like that. So they are definitely a component unit of the Housing Commission. And they probably always will be, as long as the 15-year period goes on, for sure. Go ahead.
It just, maybe another question, Clinton. Now, I've never seen those contracts. And again, that probably all happened way before I arrived. But those contracts are reviewed and they're not evergreen. Michigan doesn't acknowledge evergreen. Like the contracts for the other entity?
Yeah, they were prepared by Reno and Kavanaugh. They were reviewed by HUD. They were reviewed by MISTA, all legal departments. They were reviewed by SENER's legal departments. And they
But
were,
I didn't, like,
they
I
were
wasn't
reviewed
here.
by-
Yeah, I probably
well,
wasn't
actually, we
here.
had a meeting. I think it was the October or November meeting before, maybe earlier than that, because they kept on hoping to sign the concluding papers, in which Reno and Kavanaugh was one of the final remote meetings.
Okay.
That they presented all that information and asked for board members' questions.
That was in 21, you mean?
In we closed on December 8th, 2021. And so the final review and affirmation of all of those items was brought before the board by Reno and Kavanaugh.
Jeannie, for clarification, are you talking about the organizational documents, like the bylaws and the articles, or are you talking about like any document that was executed with Riverside?
Well, I imagine that any document that is executed by Riverside would be part of a discussion here at the Housing Commission board before signature. I would imagine the board, again, different entity, we have to give our chair approval to sign on behalf of the board. So I imagine that's what happens here too, or should happen here.
Yes, that would be my understanding with all of the red documents that it came through and the board.
Yeah.
Reviewed them, the board approved them.
Again, I'm new, I might not have gotten all that, but it's just, I'm putting it in my brain for future is what I'm looking for.
I'm newer than you, but I'm saying for my other ones, with the other ones that represent PHAs, yes, the bylaws, everything were reviewed, were approved, were amended, were reviewed and looked at, so that's.
Thank you.
So all those contracts and all that data was in that original thing that went with RAD.
Right,
That's what I'm referring to too.
right,
Okay.
okay.
Roughly like 900 pages.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Light reading.
Not fun.
So, so that basically breaks down, you know, your statement of cash flows and cash for the year. So the footnotes are required by GAAP, General Accepted Accounting Principles. There's various things stated in a lot of the footnotes, which is, I guess, 12 pages roughly. Nope, 14 pages. Anyways, one of the big things that has always been an issue is the, you know, Manistee Housing Commission, a component unit of the city. And to me, it's never been a component unit of the city.
Yeah, the financials were requested by the city in order to submit. I saw that.
So the problem is their city auditor, which I've talked to him 2 years ago, and I said, you know, prove to me, you know, that there's some sort of financial interaction, financial dependency, and financial requirement for this. He's never provided me anything. All he states is that the city mayor picks the board members or recommends the board members, which is fine. All the housing commissions are like that. But this is the only housing commission that I have that states that they're a component unit. And per my review of everything, I've never found it, but, I went with the flow of that. But because you have gotten rid of, some of your assets with RAD, and now they're under the other entity, but it's still all one. You've got to remember, I said the Riverside is a component unit of the Housing Commission, and there's fact to that. There's financial interest, there's financial interaction, and everything else. There's no financial interest, there's no financial interaction with the city, and there never has been. So when the city takes their financial statements, they do what's called a discreetly presented financial statement, which they put a column in for the City of Manistee Housing Commission. So, when you think about that, you think, well, what are they trying to say there? Does that mean that $1.2 million in cash is part of their financials? It's HUD money. It's a housing commission. It's not. They couldn't touch that money. They can't touch that money. So I'm not sure, but I talked it over with Clint, and on page 15, the financial reporting entity, we stated the Housing Commission is not a component unit of the city, and it cannot impose its will, and there's no potential for the commission to have any financial burdens from the city. So I'm not sure what'll happen, but something has to happen at their level, in my opinion, because it's not.
But they can't show that in their financials.
They do.
Okay.
And we went, last year we went through the process again with them, with an attorney, and the attorney concurred or agreed and provided them documentation that said, this isn't true. You really need, because we're going to change to RAD, to take that off your books.
We, in our mental health system, the county, there are some funds, so we are kind of intertwined, but we do a report so that they know our solvency at all times.
Mm-hmm.
We don't mingle money that much except for local match, but maybe solvency and understanding of the program, but I don't see where they can claim the revenues.
Yeah, so I think it's deceiving to have that on there.
Yeah, okay.
I think, so what I'm getting at is, because of the dramatic financial changes, everything that went off RAD, that the board needs to decide, meaning that they need to, if they're going to approve the financial statements, then this will be in there. If they aren't going to approve the financial statements with this in there, then I have to change it. Or Clint has to change it.
Mm-hmm.
Or you guys have to change it, because these are your financial statements, but yet there needs to be a situation that there's a resolution this year, because this is an important year and this would be a good time to resolve anything. So.
And we have the attorney's determination in writing on this issue?
We have the investigation that was performed by Melissa Ward, Novino, and Capito. Jeff Klug concurs with our decision on this. And we're on correct grounds on standing on this. And we just, in the past, have just gone along with it, but this is a critical year, as Andy has said, that we need to make a decision and move forward because of the changes brought about by RAD.
I think as before we decide with the full board here, I think it would be nice to have something in writing that provides us that clarification, so that when we go to vote, we will have that in writing to support the language in here. A legal opinion.
Correct. I agree 100%. I don't think none of the other PHAs, it's not like that. And just legally, they're two separate, they are separate entities. So losses wouldn't be claimed by the city, and the city wouldn't want to be obligated for any of the loans, that's the liabilities. I just don't know why, I said
And they're not.
I knew in October, I just don't know why they were included previously. It just, and I don't really know the reasoning for it.
Well, it's just, you know, small town, we like to
Yeah.
communicate, provide information. I'd like to keep that relationship with our council members, you know, but, and again, being transparent and providing them this information, legal, you know, ruling on that too, you know, just whatever we can provide so that we are all very clear on what's going on. I don't want to set up a animosity. I want everybody to come to the table to understand this.
I agree 100%.
Could you provide us something before the January meeting?
What about Melissa's materials? She went.
I will
Oh.
pull up Melissa's materials also and include those.
I mean, these are professionals that all have reviewed stuff, and it's not like it's, you know, I think it's, you know, properly presented where, you know, you stand alone, especially now that you've converted to RAD.
Yeah, and,
So-
and you know the history of this commission, you know, and what happened here. And it's just, again, it's another trusting and believing. Even though we've been great for years and years, you know, we've gone along providing that information. It just, I think it may provide some sort of easement for, you know, for our city council.
Right.
Who went through this process before. So, whatever we can do.
So like I stated, the financial, you know, the footnotes are required, you know, in your financials for GAAP, and breaks down all the various explanations of capital assets, all these different things, revenue recognition, your debt, the employee retirement system, and how you contribute to that, and when you contribute to that, or how much you're going to contribute to that for the year, things like that. So, I think the main part is, you know, the stance on financial reporting and not being a component unit. Going to page 30, you got your required information for your pension costs. That's a 10-year process, so it's going to have a 10-year chart, and talks about how funded the pension is for the year and your contributions for the year.
Where's the percentage? Oh, okay, there's percentage, all right.
Yeah.
We're doing well.
Yeah, I mean, you're one of the better ones, definitely. So hats off to you on that, because that's pretty good.
We're actually making more payments than required by MERS
Excellent.
in order to get us back up to 100, 120%.
Yeah,
Mhm.
you're doing well.
Yeah.
Compared to some I've seen.
Definitely. So, pages 32 through 40 are called the financial data schedules. These are things that are reported to HUD. So when HUD gets your information, this is exactly what they get, the schedules right here. So at the end of the year, or when we submit our audit, we submit the audit report, these financial schedules, do some checklists, and then that's submitted to HUD. They do it twice. They do an unaudited submission, and then they do a audited submission. So none of that will change. I mean, that'll be just like every year. I mean, next year you go and do the same thing, even though you've converted to RAD. So, and the blended part of that is included also, meaning that your financial report will include
Some of
Riverside.
Some of their information?
All of it, yeah.
Oh, we'll
Because
see.
it's intertwined. You got to remember that it's all mixed together in a way where one's reliant on the other's reliant, you know, so they intertwine. So,
I should state though that they're all in separate checking accounts.
yeah. Yeah.
Money separate, yeah.
Yeah, it's kept separate, but it'll have its own count.
Ordinance, yeah.
Yes. So, after that, there's 2 reports, one on compliance with internal controls, and one on compliance with government audited standards. So, when I do audit, I have to do compliance audit where I look at their files, I look at their spending, I look at their capital fund program, and I look at their CARES program, and to make sure that they spent money appropriately as they should for each program, and then didn't intertwine that money. So, on page 45, real quick, you got your two programs, public housing, and your capital funds. And then for the year, your total federal assistance was 1.1 million. Footnotes on page 46 for that. There were no findings. Their data was in proper order. And then the last 2 pages are what's called agreed upon procedures, where I submit the data to HUD, basically, is the last report. I mean, I have to confirm I put the information was put together just like it was in the audit report and has been submitted to HUD. So, any questions or? Yeah, a lot of fun reading today.
Jeannie and Karen, CMHC will get all the financial reports at the end of the year from Riverside too. That's stated in this.
All right,
All
thank
right, we don't have the same, you're not doing the same.
No,
No,
Okay, all right, okay, all right,
so.
Riverside will have to hire an auditor.
okay. All right.
Big, good meeting, and it's too bad it,
Yeah.
we didn't have.
Are you all coming back to repeat this?
And planned on it.
Be available via Zoom or any email questions, email?
But it got recorded, so.
Yes, they can watch it.
So they can watch it.
I have been watching my messages throughout our meeting to see if any word on Dale. There hasn't been anything from Anita about Dale, so still don't know his status.
Pray that he's doing well.
Yes.
Thanks, everybody who came today.
Appreciate the information was just very, very good. Really helped a lot.
Happy holidays.
Thanks for listening.
Mr. Klug, you're not related to Ron Klug, are you, from South Haven?
No, my dad's